parachutes are attached to cargo lines, and the boxes are stacked in rows along the waist of the plane. 10 boxes to a load, 20 beaver, ready for the flight to mountain meadows.
Idaho dropped 76 beavers out of a plane into a dead valley. What happened next, from 400 million to almost nothing? The collapse that came first. To really feel why Idaho was so determined to save these particular pests, you have to know what had nearly happened to the beaver as a whole. Before Europeans arrived, North America held an almost unimaginable number of beavers. Estimates run from the tens of millions into the hundreds of millions, their dams and ponds blanketing the continent and shaping the course of countless rivers. They were everywhere.
This is a story about beavers, the largest rodents in North America. Families are enjoying the sun, the scenic vistas, and the cool breeze. And somewhere high above them, beavers are parachuting from the sky. Yes, this really happened.
And then, starting in the 1600s, the fur trade arrived and turned beaver pelts into one of the most valuable commodities on the planet, prized above all for making the felt hats that were the height of European fashion. What followed was an industrial-scale slaughter that lasted 2 full centuries and helped drive the exploration and conquest of the entire interior of the continent. Trappers pushed up every river system in search of them. By around 1900, a population once numbering in the hundreds of millions had been hammered down to perhaps 100,000 scattered survivors, a collapse of well over 99%. And as the beavers vanished, so did their water. Across the West, streams that had once spread out behind beaver dams cut down into deep, dry, eroded channels. Wetlands drained, water tables dropped. The thin, bare creek that most Americans came to think of as perfectly natural was, in fact, the ghost of a beaver pond that no longer had its builder. So by 1948, when Idaho stood there holding a handful of nuisance beavers, it was holding survivors of one of the largest wildlife crashes in the history of the continent, which is exactly why nobody wanted to simply kill them. They were too valuable, and there were already far too few. Autumn.
Build dams, which filter water, flood rivers, and create crucial wetlands.
1948. An Idaho wildlife officer climbs into a small propeller plane carrying a cargo no pilot in history had ever hauled before. 76 live beavers, each one sealed inside a custom wooden box, and each box strapped to a parachute left over from the Second World War. The plane banks out over a remote, roadless valley in the Idaho backcountry. A door opens, and one by one, the boxes are pushed out into open air. 76 beavers drifting down out of the sky toward a wilderness that has absolutely no idea they're coming. It sounds like a story somebody invented in a bar after one too many. It is not. It's written into official state wildlife records. It was captured on color film that then sat mislabeled in an archive for more than 60 years, presumed lost forever. And the valley those beavers parachuted into has been quietly transforming, on its own, ever since. So here's what we're actually going to get into. Why on earth a government agency decided that airdropping rodents was the smart move. How they kept the beavers from dying on the way down, including the one test beaver who became, briefly, the most experienced skydiver in the entire animal kingdom, and what 76 beavers ended up doing over 70 years to a piece of land that's now part of one of the largest protected wild areas in the United States. Because the punchline isn't that this was a wacky stunt. The punchline is that it worked, and that the man who did it was right about something the rest of us would take another 70 years to catch up on. To understand why anyone would load a beaver into an airplane, you first have to understand the problem Idaho was desperate to solve.
Department of Fish and Game considered the Beaver Project a resounding success.
The beaver problem nobody could fix. By the late 1940s, the town of McCall, Idaho, and the farms and orchards spreading out around it had a beaver problem. And it was the kind of problem that came from a good news story going slightly sideways. After more than a century of fur trapping had nearly wiped beavers off the entire continent, the survivors were finally, slowly recovering. But as people pushed deeper into the valleys to farm and build, beavers and humans kept running straight into each other. Beavers dammed up irrigation ditches, they flooded fields and orchards overnight. They dropped prized shade trees across yards and plugged road culverts solid until the water backed up over the road. To the landowners, a beaver was simply a pest. A furry little bulldozer that turned a dry field into a pond while you slept. But here's the tension sitting at the center of the whole thing. Even back then, people understood that beavers were enormously valuable in the right place. Their dams stored water through the dry months. They stopped erosion. They built the wetlands that fish and ducks and game animals depended on. Killing them all off would have been throwing away something useful. So the state's instinct was the right one. Don't exterminate the troublemakers, relocate them, pull them out of the settled farmland where they caused chaos, and resettle them deep in the empty backcountry where every dam they built would be pure benefit. There was just one enormous problem standing in the way. The best untouched beaver country in Idaho was buried in the rugged, roadless mountain interior. Exactly the kind of high, wild, broken terrain a beaver would love, and exactly the kind of place a human could barely reach. No roads led in, none. The only way to physically get a crate of animals up there was on the back of a horse or a mule, over days of steep, punishing trail. And that, it turned out, was where the whole effort kept falling apart. Why horses and mules were a disaster. The old way of moving beavers was a slow-motion catastrophe, and the man in charge knew it better than anyone alive. His name was Elmo Heder, and he worked for the Idaho Fish and Game Department. He laid the whole problem out, plainly and a little wearily, in an official report that survives to this day. A report that has since become weirdly famous among wildlife biologists for how matter-of-factly it describes something completely insane. Moving beavers by pack animal meant strapping crates onto horses or mules and hauling them for days through the mountains, usually in the heat of summer, because that was the only time the high country was even passable. And beavers, it turns out, handle heat terribly. They get stressed, they overheat, and they get aggressive cooped up in a hot box. The pack animals hated the whole business just as much. Horses and mules are not fans of a heavy, sloshing crate full of a live, gnawing, hissing rodent lashed to their backs, and they spooked and tired fast and fought the load the entire way. The trip was slow. It was genuinely expensive in men and animals and time. And it was so hard on the beavers themselves that a lot of them simply didn't survive the journey to the new home you were trying so hard to give them. You'd haul an animal 3 days into the mountains to save its life and arrive with a casualty. The math didn't work, and Heder knew it, so he needed something else entirely. Something fast, something cheap, and something that could put a live, healthy beaver down into terrain that no road would ever reach. And then his eye landed on the one thing the war had left lying around the country in almost absurd quantities: parachutes. If this is the kind of true, almost too strange to believe history you didn't know you needed, hit subscribe. We dig up the real stories of how displaced and forgotten animals quietly reshaped the land, straight from the records. The box and a beaver named Geronimo. The country had come out of the Second World War sitting on a mountain of surplus military gear, and that mountain included thousands of parachutes that suddenly had nowhere to go and nothing to do.
The beaver population is out of control, and it's his job to do something about it.
Meanwhile, a small plane could reach those remote interior valleys in a matter of minutes, where a mule train took days. Heder could see the entire solution sitting right there in front of him. If he could just get a beaver safely from the cargo door of an airplane to the ground in one piece, the whole impossible problem solved itself. The only question, and it was not a small one, was how. How do you drop a live beaver out of an airplane without killing it on impact, and without it gnawing its way to a messy freedom at 2,000 feet? His answer was a genuinely clever piece of design, and he worked at it like an engineer. The box had to pull off two jobs at once. First, it had to hold the beaver safely through the fall. His earliest idea used woven willow, which seemed natural enough, until you remember what beavers do to wood. A beaver could chew straight through a willow box mid-flight, so he switched to a sturdier wooden design. Second, and just as important, the box had to open itself on landing, because there would be no human waiting down in that wilderness to walk over and let the animal out. So he hinged it. The principle was simple and almost beautiful. As long as the parachute lines were pulled taut in the air, the box stayed firmly shut. The instant it hit the ground and the lines went slack, the tension released, and the box fell open on its own, and the beaver could simply climb out and waddle off into its new life. But Heder was not about to trust an untested box with a whole plane full of real living animals. So before any of it, he ran trials. And for the trials, he used one particular tough old beaver that he named Geronimo. Over and over and over, poor Geronimo was loaded into the box and dropped from the test plane. Down he'd come under the chute, thump onto the field, the box would fall open, and out he'd climb, unharmed, and, one imagines, growing more deeply unimpressed with his life choices by the day. Heder wrote that Geronimo eventually got so thoroughly used to the whole routine that the moment he was let out of the box, he'd turn around and scramble right back toward it, ready to be loaded up and dropped all over again. When the real operation finally came, Geronimo got a reward for his loyal service to science. He was dropped first into the brand new wilderness territory with 3 young females for company to found a new colony, a small, strange happy ending for the most air-tested rodent in history. 76 beavers fall from the sky. In the autumn of 1948, the plan went live for real. Across the relocation effort, 76 beavers were flown out over that remote backcountry drainage and parachuted down into the valley below, box after box blooming open under their canopies and drifting toward the trees. And by the standard of basically any wildlife relocation in history, the results were astonishing. Heder reported that all but one of the 76 survived the drop. The single casualty was an animal that worked its way out of its box too early, up in the air, before it reached the ground. Every other beaver landed alive. The boxes fell open exactly as designed, and they walked out into the wild. The cost came in at a small fraction of the old horse and mule method. The stress on the animals was dramatically, measurably lower, and the beavers had been delivered to precisely the place the state wanted them, deep in roadless, protected country where their natural engineering would help the entire watershed and never once flood somebody's orchard or plug somebody's road. By every single measure Heder actually cared about, it was a clean, total success. The beavers slid into the cold mountain streams and got straight to work doing the only thing they have ever really known how to do. They built. What the beavers built, and the footage that proved it. The valley those animals dropped into would later become part of one of the largest unbroken stretches of protected wilderness in the lower 48 states, a vast, roadless expanse where natural processes are basically left alone to run with almost no human meddling at all, which, when you think about it, is just about the perfect place to put a founding population of ecosystem engineers and then simply walk away for decades and let them cook. And build they did. The mechanics are worth slowing down on, because this is the whole reason it mattered. A beaver dam slows moving water down.
About a man named Elmo, a perfectly average-sized human from Idaho. He worked as a warden with the Idaho Department of Fish and Game.
That slowed water spreads out sideways across the valley floor, instead of racing straight downhill and out of the system. It soaks into the ground, lifts the water table, and pools into ponds and wetlands. And those wetlands quietly do an enormous amount of work for the whole landscape. They hold water through bone-dry late summers, keeping streams flowing when they'd otherwise vanish. They buffer the land against both drought and wildfire, because a wet green valley bottom simply does not burn the way a dry, eroded gully does. It acts as a natural fire break. They filter sediment and clean the water, and they turn into rich nurseries for fish, waterfowl, moose, and a long list of other animals that follow the water in. Drop one founding group of beavers into protected wilderness and leave them be, and over the generations they spread up and down a whole drainage, stitching a glittering network of ponds and green meadows into a valley that used to be nothing more than a fast, narrow stream cutting a single line downhill. For most of the decades that followed, though, the story of the parachuting beavers survived mainly as local folklore, a tall tale people half believed, told with a grin and a roll of the eyes. The kind of story you assume got exaggerated somewhere along the way, until 2015. That year, an archivist at Idaho Fish and Game, going through old film reels, rediscovered the original color footage of the entire 1948 operation, which had been mislabeled and quietly forgotten for over 60 years. And suddenly, there it was, right there on the screen. The boxes, the plane, the parachutes blooming open against the sky, the beavers riding down under their canopies and waddling out of the open boxes into the wild. The legend had been completely true the entire time. And now there was footage to back up every single word of it. A strange idea that history quietly proved right. It would be easy to file the parachuting beavers away as a fun historical oddity and move on. The time a government agency airdropped rodents and somehow, against all odds, pulled it off. But that framing misses the part that actually matters now, today, in a way Heder could never have imagined. Back in 1948, Elmo Heder was not thinking about climate resilience, or carbon-storing wetlands, or trophic cascades, or anything of the sort. He was solving a stubborn, practical, almost boring headache. How do you move a valuable animal into country that humans can barely walk into, But the instinct underneath what he did, that beavers belong out in those high headwaters, that their dam building is an asset to be deliberately placed rather than a nuisance to be dynamited, was decades ahead of where almost everyone else was standing. Because look at where we've actually ended up. Today, all across the drought-hammered American West, wildlife agencies, ranchers, and watershed groups are doing on purpose, with real science and real funding behind them, the exact same thing Heder improvised with a stack of war surplus parachutes. They are putting beavers back into broken, dried-out, eroded watersheds. They're even building artificial beaver dam analogs, simple structures of posts and branches and mud to mimic beaver work and lure real beavers in to take over. And they're doing it specifically to restore water, slow floods, recharge aquifers, and build resistance to drought and fire. Because we have finally gone and measured properly how powerful that one little engineer really is, and the results have stunned the people doing the measuring. The man who dropped beavers out of an airplane in 1948 had stumbled, almost by accident and definitely by necessity, onto a truth the rest of us would need another 70 years to fully respect. The cheapest, most effective restoration tool in the entire American West was never going to be a machine, or a concrete dam, or a billion-dollar reservoir project. It was a 30-pound rodent with orange buck teeth and an unstoppable instinct to build. And sometimes, back when the roads ran out, getting that little engineer to exactly where the land needed it most just took a bit of nerve, a small airplane, and 76 leftover parachutes from a war that had only just ended. But not every rewilding story starts with trying to save an animal. Next time, we're heading to one of the most contaminated places on the entire planet, the abandoned Chernobyl exclusion zone, where scientists released a herd of the last truly wild horses left on Earth into a radioactive dead zone that every single human being had fled. What happened to those horses over the next 25 years is the exact opposite of what almost everyone expected, and it raises a deeply uncomfortable question about what's really killing wildlife. Subscribe, and I'll see you there.